Good morning. Good evening, rather. My name's Tim. I'm an alcoholic. Well, that was quite an introduction. I wouldn't say I'm sacrificing my time. I'm just spending my time. This is very low key from my point of view, and it is nice to see some faces. But I don't need anyone's respect. I really don't. I'm just gonna do my thing, and if you benefit from it, that's marvelous. And if you don't, well, there'll be someone else next week. Now, there are some people who are new, and there are some people who are new back, and one can't go in on a topic like serving God without giving some background and explaining, well, why is that even a topic in the first place? Uh, there's a Suzanne Vega line, don't uncork what you can't contain. And I can't contain drinking. I've never given up drinking in my life. I remember saying to a sponsor, I've given up drinking, and he said, you haven't given it up, it's given you up. And that's not just a cute little saying. The fact is, when I start drinking, I'm going to carry on drinking until something stops me. And I'm not the thing, I'm not the something which stops me. It's got nothing to do with consequences. I had consequences for years and didn't stop. I'm simply stopped. I find myself in a position where I'm sober. And that seems to be a phenomenon. Most of my friends during their drinking had the same experience, that they drink for years, terrible consequences having absolutely no effect. And then suddenly, one day, they make the phone call. Well, why that day? It's not insight. One could have had the insight at any time, but one doesn't. So that's a gift. The ability to even stop is a gift. And opportunity is not a lengthy visitor. And so if that gift has been given, the job of everything else I do in AA is to turn that temporary pass into permanent membership. In the same way that with a gym you might get a temporary pass, but at some point you'll have to start paying your dues. If you don't pay your dues, the temporary pass is going to run out. And I first came to AA in January 1993. My sobriety date is in the July of 1993. And I was given a few temporary passes, and each one expired without me having to start to pay the dues. Drinking again for someone like me is very dangerous, not just because I don't get to decide how many months or longer it's going to be before I stop again, but because of the sheer quantity that I'm drinking, I just do dangerous things. Why? It doesn't matter. The fact is, I do. And the mortality rate of people I've known who've slipped is very high. So the most important thing in my life is not to have a drink. Yet that is the one thing which, being powerless over alcohol on my own devices, I can't bring about. And I know that I'm sure even those of you who are new have twigged that God is mentioned in AA and there is a notion of a higher power and so on. And we're very good at watering it down, perhaps necessarily, and saying to people, well, you can have, your AA group as the higher power or nature or something. And I tried that. I tried to use in particular people as my higher power. I thought, well, AA is a power greater than me, so I'm going to use AA to stop me drinking. But a funny thing happens when you do that, or at least when I do that. I wear it out. I remember when I was very new, I would call people when I wanted to drink, and they'd say all the right things, and then I wouldn't want to drink, and then I'd be all right. By the time I got to the August 1993, I would phone people. They'd say all of the wonderful things that had worked to stop me from drinking last time, but these little magical things stopped working. Anything human is going to wear out. I needed something more. I needed something direct. And I had an experience in, I think, the August 1993, where the one thing I hadn't done in order to guarantee sobriety on a particular day was to appeal directly to God. And I appealed directly to God, and I was granted not just the ability to stay sober, but the voice, the insistent voice, and the sort of ding dong back and forth about whether I was going to drink just stopped. My mind was stilled, and I was able to call it a day for a day and wake up the next morning as right as rain. And this was wonderful and disappointing at the same time. It was wonderful because I had stayed sober, and I found a way of staying sober by contacting a higher power directly. But it was terribly disappointing because it meant I could never drink again. At least not. I could no longer drink again under the guise of powerlessness, under the heading of powerlessness. Once I'm given power, once I'm given access to power, I'm afraid the game really is up. After that, if I were to drink again, it would be a different matter. It would be an active rejection of the availability of sobriety. So I was cornered, I was treed, as they say. Now, the difficulty with the relationship with God is that although I got, as it were, an upgraded sort of free pass on that occasion, what won't work in the long term is to live my own life as I see fit and then think, well, in a crisis, I'll call out to God. I have a feeling in that particular situation, the thought to call out to God actually came from God in the first place. Because I'd never thought of that before. It wasn't on the cards. I think I was, as they say, thrown a bone. I was sincerely trying in AA, but misguided. So I think God threw me a bone. From that point onwards, it was my job to do something about this problem of my alcoholism. Now, it talks in the 12 and 12, which is a very good book, about the fallacy of two-stepping. So to go through my recovery experience with a clear idea that left to my own devices, I'll drink and may never stop. And combining that with telling other people about that in step 12, and it's called two-stepping. You're doing step 1 and a bit of step 12. That's certainly a trap. But the other trap is to believe that I can take step 3 and turn my will and life over to God and simply somehow get on with serving God on a daily basis. Now, this is not to say that one can't start to do that. The steps are in an order for a reason, and that's because we have a numbering system which places things in order. That really is the only reason they're in an order. If you decide to number, you're going to end up with things in an order, and the numbering is helpful for reference purposes. But when AA started, they very much threw people in at the deep end. They indoctrinated people with the AA program, if I dare use that term, over the course of simply a few days. There's a story in the big book about a chap who was taken through the program by Dr. Bob, and he leads him through the program in an afternoon. So they were thrown in to do everything all at once. Uh, I met people at a conference many years ago. I was over in the States in Denver or near Denver, and I was with some friends from the UK, and there were lots of locals there, people from all over the States. Now, my friend at the time was 5 years sober, and had, oh, actually, maybe even less than that, maybe 2 or 3 years sober. And he'd had by that point, 100 sponsees. As we know, sponsees often don't last, they'll go on to the next person. There's a lot of chopping and changing. So he'd had a few who'd lasted the course, but certainly he'd sponsored at one point or another 100 people or so. The others around the table, who are 5, 6, 7 years sober, most of them had never sponsored anyone, having been told, "Oh, you're not ready yet," or "You haven't finished your step 9," or other things. I don't think that will do. I think if one makes a decision to turn one's will and life over to God, that entails doing steps 10, 11, and 12 right from the get-go. And indeed, it says on page 84 that we start this practice of step 10 as we begin the process of cleaning up the past. And I was got doing step 10s right from the beginning. I was got doing a rudimentary form of step 11, and I was told to share at every meeting. And to keep my mouth shut about any problems I had, and simply to pass on useful things I'd heard and how I'd been applying them and how useful they were to me. I was told to do that straight away. I think there is some wisdom in some groups. I understand why they do it, to say you can't share until you've done step 5, because some people have got no boundaries whatsoever. Now, I was trained on how to have boundaries early on, but sometimes the easiest way is just to have a blanket rule. But it does prevent people from starting to turn around everything they've learnt, push it back out the door. I've got to push out the door everything I'm given in AA. There's a line about the new AA member being like a gaunt prospector pulling his belt tight, who strikes gold and will continue to mine gold for the rest of his life, provided he gives away the whole product. So I've got to, and as I did right from the beginning, immediately start to turn it around and try and help other people. And I went to the so-called Joys of Recovery meetings, the Vision for You meetings, which I think had their faults, but they had the great merit of being practical, of getting people into the steps quickly, of getting people into helping others quickly. So the notion of serving God, there's nothing particularly theological about it. There's certainly nothing monastic about it. One isn't being asked to be a monk or a nun or a hermit or the Bishop of Norwich. The job of serving God is to do the work that one is given to do, and the work that one is given to do as an alcoholic is to do the one thing which we are singularly qualified to do, and which, if we don't do it, will not get done, which is to carry to others what was passed to us in an unending chain of fiery contagion. Now, as I say, two-stepping won't work on it. Better than nothing, better than no stepping, but it's a far cry from a long-term solution. And even making a decision in step 3 and doing the 10, 11, 12 dance right from the beginning, better than nothing, certainly better than what some people do. But one needs the whole package deal. And the question is why? Why do we need steps 4 through 9? if we've made a decision to get on with basically being nice to people, being industrious, being kind, patient and tolerant, carrying the message of AA to others, explaining alcoholism to others, why can't we just get on with that? And the answer is, I could want to, but I just won't. There's stuff that has to be gotten out of the way. When I got sober, and I think this is by and large true for anyone who gets sober, you may be an exception yourself, but I think it's by and large true that, well, certainly I was very concerned with myself. Now, I didn't think of myself as a particularly selfish person. Sometimes people house all sorts of things under the heading of alcoholism. And they're simply not certain forms of meanness or bullying or whatever people have done before, violence before they got to AA. I don't think those are necessarily connected with alcoholism. But the one thing which is pretty universal is a form of selfishness. Now, as I say, I didn't consider myself to be selfish. I wasn't. Most of my steps 8 and 9 came out of carelessness and negligence, as opposed to outright putting myself in front of other people. But I was selfish. I was self-centered in the sense that if you produced a pie chart of what I thought about on a daily basis, and we have the famous 7 areas of self from pages 64 to 65 of pride, what other people think about me, self-esteem, what I think about me, personal relations and sex relations, how others treat me, pocketbooks, American term for finances, ambitions and security, so my wants and my needs respectively. If you'd done a pie chart and said, well, how much of the day am I occupied with those questions? And then how much of the day is occupied with the welfare of others or the task at hand? The answers would have been horrific. I was preoccupied with myself. Now, it's no good saying, well, I shall go and serve God, but I'll do that in the 4.5 minutes a day when I happen not to be entirely preoccupied with my emotions and, in particular, my grievances and my besetting fears. That needs to be cleared out of the way, and that's the job of step 4. Just one little note on step 4. I've often received phone calls over the years where people say that they're full of resentment. So I then say, well, what are you doing about it? And they say, well, I'm writing. I've written pieces of inventory. I've written 47 pages of inventory. That will do no good whatsoever. In step 4, one might need to do that as part of a process of preparing for step 5. But one's got to get rid of the resentment. One's got to get rid of the fear. It can't be done without God, but it won't be done without considerable effort on my part. The policy decision that I do not want to be a person who bears grievances, who sits cowering in the face of the future with endless, nameless dreads. I've got to make the decision. I've had to make the decision, and I've made the decision. I don't want to be that sort of person. And my job is simply to guard my mind against such thoughts when they occur, and to replace them with thoughts, in the case of grievances, of love, and to replace thoughts of fear with absolute confidence in God. God will provide the direction and strength for what to think instead of grievances and what to think instead of fear. I'm the one that has to do the work. So that had to be gotten firmly out of the way. The book also talks about other things. Whenever the book says, if you do this, you'll drink, or if you don't do this, you'll drink, there are quite a few such references in the book, you know that those are all things which are standing in the way of a relationship with God, and therefore standing in the way of sobriety itself. Just to make absolutely clear, the reason God is necessary is because, left to my own devices, when the thought of a drink occurs, it will seem attractive, or at least innocuous. And even on those rare occasions when I was actually in my right mind when presented with the notion of drinking, somehow alcoholism would override me and I'd drink anyway. I need something to block that thought from converting into action. The only thing I've found is God. And the blocking comes in the form of a combination of a visceral reaction and automatically doing the right thing, leaving the situation I'm in, running for the hills. Sanity returns considerably later, but I'm given the defense. So the other points in the book where it says you need to do this or do this, avoid that in order to stay sober are very important. Other ones are ongoing harm to other people for which I'm not sorry. Pages 69 and 70. What else have we got? Secrets, they'll do it. Unfaced creditors, unmade amends. Anything which destroys unity in tradition 1, it was read out this evening, that if we don't hang together, we'll fall apart as an organisation. And if we fall apart as an organisation, well, that would be the end of me. I need AA, if for no other reason than to find alcoholics to work with. It would be very hard to find them otherwise. It'd be possible, but hard. So I need AA. The worst thing I can do in AA is to sow division. And I've been in AA for 33 years. And I've seen what happens when division arises. It can be division between groups. It can be division between the fellowship and the service structure, between the service structure and the general service board and office. It can be division within a group where Sally won't sit with Susan, or Susan won't sit with Sally, or someone else is has got the hump and is sending someone else to Coventry. No offence to anyone who is from Coventry. That sort of behaviour is, and I've engaged in it, and I don't now, is dangerous. You don't know who you're going to need. You don't know who's going to be there in 30 years' time. I cannot afford to have any kind of either open warfare or cold war with anyone else in recovery. Doesn't mean I have to be chummy with everyone. But what I can do is be polite and civil and friendly. And if I've got a grievance, I can it. Save it for elsewhere. If I can't get over it straight away, it mustn't slip through my face. I mustn't leak. And there are others. There are other things which must be gotten out of the way. And the biggest one is the making of amends. And essentially, if you add up all of these things that have to be gotten out of the way, I think they broadly fall into two categories. Whilst I was chiefly concerned with security, people I've known generally fall into security or ambitions as to what is the biggest driver. Some people, I suppose, personal relations. But for me, it's always been security. My circumstances when I was growing up were very insecure for various reasons. So perhaps because of that, security has always been the weak point. If I don't trust God and think that I'm directly responsible for my security, my personal security, my personal finances, my ability to continue living. That's going to take up my attention. There's no time for God and the things that God might want me to do. So I've got to lose my concern with myself and trust that God will genuinely look after me. Now, this isn't a recipe for recklessness and not taking care of the things which it is my job to take care of. God will do for me what I cannot do for myself, but he won't do for me what I can do for myself. And in fact, it's quite the reverse of recklessness. Let's say I say God will look after me financially. The direction I've got on my part in that is to write down every penny I spend. I have for 25 years. I look at it every month. I know exactly, literally, where every penny has gone for the last 25 years. I've got the records. I know the value of money now, and I didn't know the value of money 25 years ago. And that was my responsibility to do that. But there is a fundamental trust in God. And what this means is when God directs me to do things other than work, or to go down a different path in terms of my occupation than my ambition would have me go down, I've had to learn to trust that. So there's got to be a dropping of concern with oneself and a replacement of that concern with a very simple trust in God. To say God will look after me if I do the two things that is set out on page 63. Stay close to God, which means prayer and meditation, talking to God, and performing his work well, which means structuring the content of my day as I believe God would have it. So to be a wholehearted employee of God, as it were, what I must do is abandon all of the other side gigs and side hustles. So even though I do have an occupation, which is a perfectly ordinary one, that's not a career, because I'm now employed by God, and God happens to deploy me on certain days, doing things which look rather a lot like an ordinary job, but I know they're not. That I'm simply doing things for God. Money seems to come in. So that's the first broad category of things which have to be sorted out. The second broad category is this. All of those things which induce guilt, and the things which will induce guilt, secrets, so doing things that I shouldn't do, and then not being sorry enough to actually admit it to another human being, thinking I can keep those little secrets in one corner. The second thing is, if you'll pardon the use of a term from elsewhere, attack thoughts. And this is any form of negativity, cynicism, grievance, resentment, jealousy, envy, doesn't matter what it is, but a thought pattern which involves attacking others or even me. Because what I'm doing then is attacking whatever God has created or permitted to be made. Attack thoughts will generate guilt and also harm to others, particularly if it is unamended. These will generate guilt, and now it's not a religious program, but occasionally a religious image will help get something across more quickly. In the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve eat the apple, one of the first things they do is hide. When I'm guilty, the last person I want to come across in the shrubbery is God, because something in me knows that God is the origin of those rules that instinctively I know I've broken. And it's interesting to me that that moral instinct has got nothing to do with what is inculcated in me by society. I grew up in an extremely liberal environment, very progressive, very modern. And I've discovered that my guilt tells me all sorts of things off the menu for me, which modern society would say have at it. So guilt is not a result of being oppressed, being inhibited by a repressive culture. There's something far deeper going on. So if I have things I'm guilty about, I won't want contact with God, because God, in my mind, would be the punisher of those things. Now, whether God punishes is really a separate question. But in that state of guilt, I will be frightened of God. And you can't very well serve God and be frightened of God at the same time. It's not going to work. I can't want to communicate with God and at the same time avoid the relationship. So that's what those intermediate steps are about. I really don't think, as I used to, that the intermediate steps 4 through 9 are about cleaning up my psychology or, for heaven's sake, getting to know who I am. I don't think the steps taught me anything about who I am. I'm not interested in who I am. It's not one of the concerns of the programme. And it's not to learn how to, as it were, manage my depression or anxiety or any of the other things I came into recovery with. The purpose of them is to free me up so that I can serve God in a single-minded, single-hearted way. And that's it. It's to remove those things which have been blocking me. Hence, it's a moral inventory, not a psychological inventory. So they really are defects of character. They're not defences. They're not jolly good things which have failed to serve their purpose. I believe there is such a thing as morality. There is such a thing as right and wrong. And that simplifies matters entirely. So my job with the programme is not to understand myself. I don't think there's anything to understand. My job is to drop myself like it's hot, to recoil with horror at how I'd been living, so that I can wholeheartedly get on with serving God. Without, as Lot's wife did, looking back and turning into a pillar of salt. There's got to be a wholehearted surrender. Now, the actual serving of God is a disarmingly straightforward matter. I heard someone say many years ago, and the way they put it was far cruder than this, but she said, "You're of no use to anyone if you're in a devil of a state yourself." She didn't say devil. And she's absolutely right. I have to put my own oxygen mask on first. Now, that doesn't mean that I get to spend 10 years taking myself on dates, as they say, and having bubble baths and avoiding responsibility and difficulty simply because I've been so hard on myself for so many years. It's time to be kind to myself. No. Looking after myself means fitting myself to be of maximum service to God, which means I needed to sort out my finances, my diet, my exercise routine, my sleep. I needed to cut out any of the crap which was not doing me any good. I have to be frightfully careful with media and social media. My life needed to be cleaned out. The kindest thing I can do for myself, is to be extremely strict and extremely disciplined with myself on all sorts of matters where I'm liable to be lax and self-indulgent. So being kind to myself is not to be self-indulgent, it's actually quite the reverse. That fits me to be able to get on energetically with doing God's will. So the job, once I'm in a fit condition, is to ask God for my life to be filled with obligations. So this is not for the faint-hearted. when it talks in the literature about doing God's will, it literally means doing things which take time, which take effort, which require, which entail uncertainty, which entail short-term pain, and which entail the sacrifice of other things in the sense of foregoing other things. If I do A, I can't do B. I've tried to sponsor people who have, shall we say, high-flown careers, the sort that require 70 or 80 hours a week work. I don't know how to do what is asked of me by God and do one of those jobs. They'll have to find someone who's found a way to make that work. I haven't. So I'm asked to do lots of things by God, and it is alarming how few of those have got anything to do with earning money. So very bad news if you think recovery is about getting rich. Good luck. And it is tough, but it's not as tough as the alternative. One can only choose between the available options. And dying of alcoholism is no walk in the park. But here's the funny thing, even though this, in the presentation of it, appears tough, I would not swap my condition, my situation, my life with that of any of my non-AA friends. The fact is, I have a system for handling any practical difficulty and emotional challenge, which people who are not forced to acquire such a system generally don't have. The person who can naturally handle anything without a program being instilled in them is rarer than a hen's tooth. But AA is full of people who are able to handle anything which is thrown at them. So what turns out to be a blessing, which is this design for living which works in all circumstances, looks like a curse at the beginning. Alcoholism looks like a curse. The solution looks worse than the problem for a while. So the job, I think, is simply encourage people. It's a lot nicer on the inside doing this than can be described to you, or it will look from the outside. It looks like prison, and it's quite the reverse. I tell you what prison is. Prison is being pushed around by your own impulses and thoughts and feelings. That's what being run on self-propulsion is. It means all of those thoughts and impulses and drives and ambitions and wants and needs and whatevers are in charge, running my life. Just because they're coming from me does not mean that I'm not a slave. Because I don't make those. When I'm full of desires and wishes and plans and schemes and ambitions and all of those things, I didn't make those on purpose. They just arise from within me. To live in accordance with those is to be a slave. Whereas to positively opt to do God's will and to be given, frankly, a great deal of discretion by God in exactly how my time is to be disposed of. Which of the there are always you see this is why it's freedom. There are always 10,000 more opportunities to do God's will. 10,000 more than there is time to do them. There's a considerable choice, and one doesn't even need to fuss. Any of them will be good. There are 1,000 meetings in London a week. Which one is it God's will I go to? I don't think God cares particularly, because I can be useful at any one. Freedom. I get to choose. But I only get to choose if I don't care, and then I can choose. The chief thing that I must do in AA is carry the message. Everything else is subsidiary to that. I spent a long time, years in fact, trying to get high and fixed by going to meetings, listening to recordings, listening to workshops, listening to this thing on the steps and that thing on the traditions and that other thing on the concepts, are not doing a damn thing with any of the information. So my job is to spend about 5% of the time taking in information and 95% of the time applying it. God wants me to be busy. I think my first sponsor said the great enemy of any alcoholic trying to recover is unstructured free time. He hasn't phoned me in the intervening period to tell me that he was wrong. So I'm going to continue taking that to be true. It serves me very well. I structure my time carefully. And there's no shortage of things God gives me to do. But the core of it is carrying the message to others. And just to finish off in the last few seconds, what is AA? Well, I went to a clubhouse meeting yesterday, lunchtime, with maybe 15, 20 people at it. And it was a typical clubhouse lunchtime meeting. All sorts were in the room. People very new, people who are very troubled, people coming in, walking out, dancing all around. There was a lot of damage in the room. That's where I belong, carrying the message for my little 5 minutes to whoever happens to be there. That's the heart of AA. And I'm going to stop at that. Thanks for listening. So, my main job when carrying the message is not to explain God. There is a line on page 15 of the big book where it says that Bill and his wife abandoned themselves to helping others to a solution to their problem. So I'm showing people how to buy the railway ticket, let's say to Edinburgh. I don't need to say anything about Edinburgh. They'll find Edinburgh when they get there. My job is to help them buy the ticket, get them on the train, and make sure they don't get off before the train departs. So the chief focus is on the working of the steps, and that's the absolute end of it. There is enough in the chapter We Agnostics. If you simply go through the chapter We Agnostics with a sponsee and share your, as they say, experience, strength, and hope, or thoughts, just how about thoughts provoked, elicited by the paragraph in question or the line in question, then that's enough to begin with. You don't have to solve theology before you take step 2. You simply need something of a notion of what you're heading towards. But the person will discover God for themselves. And people have very different experiences of that. One can't preempt that. So someone said, a sponsee said recently he has the fear of God in him. Should he fear God? I suppose we're sort of straying into theological territory here, and it's also a phrase which is used in certainly Christianity and Judaism. If you want to investigate the question of fearing God, you might want to, once you're 5 to 10 years sober, go and learn some biblical Hebrew and go and learn some Koine Greek and learn about what words in those original languages mean that translate as fear. I would say my own experience with this, if you think about people you respect, and let's say you're doing some work and you're frightened of what their judgment is going to be, I think that's perfectly reasonable. It's perfectly healthy. It shouldn't expand to a pathological degree. But there's cause and effect. There are consequences in the universe. I should be frightened of those consequences. Now, that fear, there's quite a difference between a flash of fear in recognition of a danger and letting fear swamp me Those are two entirely different things. I think the traditional answer to the question of fear of God is it's a sort of awe in the face of something enormous and unfathomable. And it's a form of respect. It's not the fear that one has of a bully, and it's not the fear that one has of a nuclear bomb. The trouble is with the word fear, it can mean too many different things. It's deployed to denote too many different things. If you want a good, and this is probably the best one, a good description of what the fear of God is like in a positive sense, what I'd recommend you do, this is non-conference approved literature, but to read Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. There is a scene in there where one of the small woodland creatures gets lost and then is found, and two of the characters find this little lost creature in the care of the great god Pan, and it describes their response to being in the presence of this great god, and it's frightening. Their knees are trembling, but it's not a bad trembling. So I think it's a theological question. I wouldn't worry too much about it as far as AA is concerned. Jimmy. Yeah, so the question of how to start sponsoring people, how to handle the first 100 sponsees. I was discussing this with a friend, I think in the last day or two, and you can't go wrong by simply starting at the beginning of the big book, and you take a paragraph and you get them to read a paragraph, and in some of the dense parts of the book where there's a lot going on and a lot to say, maybe one line. So when you get to how it works, one line is sufficient at a time, especially in the step 3 section. In steps 10 and 11, one line at a time. Other chapters, you can do a paragraph at a time. And all you have to do is say what your experience is of, if there's an action, taking the actions. Or if there's an idea, what your understanding of the idea is. So, with the question of whether sponsorship is mandatory, I think we have to carry the message, because that's what it says in step 12. Now, the form in which you carry it is down to a combination of the individual's willingness and the opportunities made available. Not every named sponsorship relationship, in other words, not every relationship which is called sponsorship, involves very much carrying of the message at all. Sometimes it can really take the form of friendship, and it can take the form of, sometimes, heaven forbid, trying to fix the person. And then there are all sorts of other situations where Sally is talking to Susan and she's conveying the nuts and bolts of the program. Sally is not Susan's sponsor, but she's doing the job of a sponsor. So what matters is the substance, not what it's called. What I certainly wouldn't do is try to, in advance, find a way out of it just because one's frightened of it or nervous about it, saying, well, can I get away without doing it? I think the aim is to say to God, I'm perfectly willing. I think this line is in Bill's story. I'm perfectly willing to do whatever is necessary. And it's that phrase, perfectly willing. I'm perfectly willing to do whatever is necessary and to fit myself to do that. And then let God work with that. But one, I think, has to want to do the 12th step. All 3 parts. One has to want to wake up out of the realm of the material into the realm of the spiritual. One has to want to carry the message, and then let the rest of one's life be a demonstration of the practice of the principles. And the reason I stress that is because, well, it says so on page 58. If you have decided you want what we have, not just technically recognise that my bread would be better buttered on that side, but I think one's got to want it. Because otherwise, I know this from experience, when I've had periods of having had very bad experiences of sponsoring and thinking, well, F that, I don't want to do that anymore, I'm fed up with it. Still putting my hand up for sponsorship, no one will ask me. Why? Because I don't want to do it. As soon as I want to do it, I'm cooking with gas, as they say. And if one doesn't want to, there's an answer to that. You say to God, I don't appear to want to sponsor. I know technically I ought to be up for helping people, but I just feel repelled by it, or whatever it is. Say to God, can you do something with that? Because I can't do anything with it. I don't know what to do about that, and God will. Because God seems to be able to do anything. So, Andrew, should we go on to our last question? Yeah, so on the question of compliance versus surrender, for those that haven't seen that juxtaposition before, essays by Harry M. Tiebout, who was a psychiatrist, who was one of the early trustees of the AA General Service Board, or whatever it's called, the equivalent in America, in the 1950s. And he wrote some very good essays. He introduced a number of people to AA, and he was really instrumental in the early days of AA. And he makes this distinction. In surrender, you're throwing yourself in, all in. You say, whatever you want me to do, AA or God, I'll do it. Compliance is grudging. You'll do it, but you'll be damned if you do it with a cheerful look on your face. It's a technical performance of the actions. Now, if my heart isn't in something, my experience is that the heart will eventually win. It's setting up a tension between what I feel and what I do, and that tension will resolve one way or another, which is why it's no good saying just my actions are right, doesn't matter what I feel about them. I've had friends who were terribly good at complying. I know someone that complied for 10 years, talked an awful lot about discipline, but eventually the heart won out and he left AA. So, in the short term, however, if the choice is between if the only two available options are compliance or nothing because you can't surrender, at least comply because you're staying in the game then. There is a chance that if you comply for long enough and you ask God to help you resolve the inner conflict, then God will do God's side of it, and then the emotions come in line with the actions, and then you've surrendered. If you fool around at the top of a water slide for long enough, eventually you'll find yourself sliding down, even against your will, and then you give in to it. I'm sliding, I might as well enjoy it. And I think that's what surrender looks like. You slip in a good sense, and then you get used to it because you've got no other choice. So I think that's the end of that one.